We have other plans. Have you been watching, Master?
The child's skill with a lightsaber are most impressive.
Oh, hey there. Didn't notice you come in. I'd like to talk to you guys about Star Wars. Now, almost everyone in our generation knows of Star Wars, but what not everybody understands is all the political overtones. So basically, in reference to the original trilogy, which many people are familiar with, you have an overwhelming force on one side, the Empire, fighting against a very minimal force scattered throughout the galaxy, the Rebellion, and basically it's an allegory to the Great Revolution or other great wars such as the Vietnam War, where you have a small tactical force using guerrilla warfare to win their battles. So many of the viewers understand the different political powers, especially moving away from the original trilogies into the prequels, where you get more of a sense of what type of political structures are in place, and you see more things such as dictatorships and monarchies, and most importantly, democracy.
I love democracy. I love the Republic.
So what originally got me into Star Wars was my aunt and uncle, who actually worked on many of the Star Wars films. I think they've worked on all of them except for one. And they were set designers, prop designers. And that's kind of what got me into it, because they would send me stuff from the scenes. And as a little kid, I wasn't that into it. But later on, I got a good appreciation for it. Now, what makes me want to talk about the political aspect of it was I recently took a political science class, and it opened my eyes up to quite a bit. And I just feel that those two can be related pretty well. Some planets or star systems are actually run just like Earth, where you have different people ruling different sections of it. Like you can have, we'll say, we have America here, Canada, Mexico. There it would be the Senate rules this, and then you have this being run by the natives, and then a moon has its own inhabitants, and they each own their own portion of that. From the core systems, the farther out into the outer rim you get, the less structured it is. The farther from the seat of power, the more things tend to disintegrate into anarchy, and it's just harder to control them. But that's not just out in the outer rim. It also happens in the core systems, such as Coruscant itself, which is a planet layer upon layer of civilizations. I'll talk more about that later. Sometimes it's hard to grasp who controls every sector, and sometimes it's ever-changing. Some of these races also take their land through brutality. We can see similar brutality in Rwanda in the last century. Star Wars, which actually came out in 1977, predates the Rwanda genocide in 1994. Ironic how art imitates reality. So what's key to understand is the main power structure in the Star Wars universe spans from the core systems, which basically try to govern everything. And you can definitely see that in our modern governments, where we try to oppose our beliefs and systems onto other countries. But it's a little different in the Star Wars universe because it is very large.
On the first image, we can see a basic events location map. As you can see, it barely touches up on the amount of planets and systems with life in them. It's just a basic map. We can see near the bottom 3 planets of interest. Endor, the home of the Ewoks, Hoth, one of the snow planets, and Tatooine, the desert planet. Now in this map you can see more of the regions. In the white, that's Hutt-owned space. You can also see the core colonies in the center, and the inner to the outer rim marked in blue and light blue. You can also see the unknown regions, where if you watch some of the series, they do touch up a bit on what's out there. So much of the political tension in Star Wars actually directly relates to US history, if not world history. Over the thousands of years of the Star Wars history, there had to have been some sort of time frame put into place in order to coordinate all of this. And they did. It is the Galactic Standard Time. Not every species in Star Wars uses the same time, but it's the standard. So, basically, ABY stands for after the Battle of Yavin, and BBY stands for before the Battle of Yavin. Now, if you're not familiar with the Star Wars films, the Battle of Yavin took place during the movie A New Hope, which was the 1977 film. Now, there really is too much to cover in the politics of Star Wars. A good place to start would be to learn the three different eras of the Republic: the Old Republic, the Galactic Republic, and the New Republic. Predating the Galactic Republic was the Old Republic. Back then it was just called the Republic, and that was roughly 25,000 BBY. The Old Republic was a federal parliamentary system, similar to the system in place in Great Britain today. A huge turning point in the Republic was the Great Sith Wars, which took place in 3,996 BBY. It threw the entire galaxy into turmoil and saw the rise of the Sith again. Now, what truly brought the end of the Old Republic, though, was the Mandalorian Wars. Now, if you're familiar with the Mandalorians, you know that they're not a race, they are a creed. During the Mandalorian Wars, the Republic forces were overrun, till a group of Jedi led by Revan and his friend Malak turned the tide. Unfortunately, these two great Jedi ended up turning over to the dark side due to Sith corruption. Eventually, though, Revan came back to the light and ended up killing his friend Malak. In the process, Judas's position in Da Vinci's The Last Supper, foreshadowing his betrayal of his friend Jesus Christ, comes to mind. Now, the Jedi and the Sith are both ancient Force wielders, at least their origin, but the key difference is how the Sith primarily focus on the dark side, and Jedi the light. Now, a funny coincidence I realized is how many politicians in our day and age identify with Jedi or Sith using quotes or something or other. And what I've noticed is more Republicans tend to use Sith quotes and more Democrats use Jedi quotes. Now, my example is actually Reagan, who is a Republican, but he actually said, "May the Force be with us." And more popularly, Obama also used the Jedi quote. But I just thought it was a funny coincidence that certain politicians pick certain sides of Star Wars. It's not just politicians who use it on both sides, it's also activists and the regular working man. You know, Star Wars has become a huge part of our culture, and it's hard to go a week without at least hearing one Star Wars quote. It's not just quotes like from Han Solo where somebody says, "Great kid, don't get cocky." There's also a lot of quotes in there that people use to help push their arguments out or to make them more valid. A good quote would be, "In the end, cowards are those who follow the dark side." Now, getting back to the planet I originally wanted to talk about, Coruscant. The Senate operated for many parts of the galaxy, but its main vibrant heart and capital of the galaxy would be Coruscant. It's a planet completely covered in concrete and metal city. Coruscant has a huge and diverse population from all over the galaxy, living in somewhat peace and harmony. The skyscrapers touched the clouds, floating rivers of flying vehicles and speeders filled the air. The surface of the planet hadn't seen sun in some spots in thousands of years. The upper levels showed prosperity, whereas the deeper you went into the planet, it slowly became a third world country. Some levels went rogue, sparking apocalyptic chaos, poverty, and desperation. Although much of the planet was thriving, most of the underworld was not. This was still better than in some places where gangs ruled entire solar systems. Comparing the levels of the planet Coruscant to our own culture, the lowest levels would be as poverty-stricken as South Sudan. As we moved upwards, the poverty level lessens with each level. In the same geographical location on the upper levels, they could be thriving like in New Zealand, with technology far surpassing our fastest growing cities. Just like in our own political climate, sometimes we tend to dip our toes in other countries' problems, sometimes to help our allies, but sometimes for personal gain. Such is the way of the Galactic Senate. Of course, there are policies and bills being passed right there on their own planet, but the reach of the Senate in foreign territories is always dominant, and sometimes they forget about the people under them, just as we do on our own society. Between 34 BBY and 19 BBY, many of the senators in the Senate started to deviate from democracy. We see a lot of this happen between Episode 1, The Phantom Menace in 1999, and Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith in 2005. The Senate heavily influenced the galaxy, but many places didn't feel its reach. Places like Tatooine, where slavery is still thriving. So many of those at the chairs in the Senate or species themselves didn't want to be a part of the war that was inevitable. Unfortunately, due to their location, some of them had no choice, and they were thrust into war just because of where they were. And, they couldn't afford to be neutral. Now, during the Clone Wars, the Trade Federation actually signed on with Count Dooku to become a part of the Separatists. Now, the Trade Federation itself was a collection of star systems and corporate titans that had made their own alliances. Now, what originally got the gears of war moving for this was the Trade Federation actually sent battle droids to the peaceful planet of Naboo to cause a crisis in the government. So, A Phantom Menace came out in 1999. And shortly after, in 2001, we were attacked by a terrorist organization. Now, the movie almost reflects the time before peace, where the powers are rising, we're not completely aware of them. In 2002, the movie The Clone Wars came out, and that one directly reflects what was happening across seas in Iraq and Afghanistan, where now you have two larger forces are clashing, and the scenery reflects it too. The Geonosis is a almost desolate desert planet, not like Tatooine where it's more sand. This is more rock, and it really shows the insurgencies and the battles where things are more head-on. I think these pictures really reflect how we went to war in the early 2000s, and then this movie just happens to come out just after that. I think it's much less than a coincidence that they just seem to align so perfectly. So between 1940 and 1973, you could get drafted to fight for your country. Such was the fate of many of the planets at this time, like I was talking about earlier. I think there were few exceptions, like the Geonosians, who were fighting alongside the Separatists during the Clone Wars, although they weren't there for long. So the clones were secretly commissioned by Master Sifo Dyas, who became a member of the Jedi Council. He earned his way to the Jedi Council because he had the power of foresight, and he foresaw the war before it happened. After the events that happened at Naboo, when the Sith actually revealed themselves, that's when he had the vision of it. Unfortunately, his friend, Count Dooku, murdered him, so he didn't get to see the clone army. Alright, now getting into one of my more favorite parts about Star Wars is the clones themselves. Now, the Clone Wars series didn't come out until 2008, but when it did, it started filling in the gaps of everything that happened between Episode 2, The Clone Wars, and Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. The clones were unintentional traitors. They fought alongside the Jedi in countless battles, laying their lives down for the Grand Army of the Republic. Without the clones backing the Republic, the Jedi alone would not have been able to fight off all of the droids that would have spread across the entire galaxy, taking over the core systems. Unfortunately, most of the clones had been implanted with a biological chip, which made them follow orders more compliantly, while limiting some of their other traits. The chip had a hidden feature, though, which made the clones turn against the Jedi and all who supported them. As the Clone Wars was coming to an end, the Separatist leaders all but being defeated in one foul swoop, the newly appointed Chancellor of the Senate, Palpatine, executed Order 66. What this order did was trigger the chip inside of their head, making all of the clones attack their Jedi commanders. As time went on, the clones were slowly phased out, more and more people were accepted into the ranks of the newly founded empire, and the Supreme Chancellor appointed himself the Emperor. This is where the democracy turned into a dictatorship, all with the help of the clones, unwillingly. In the first Star Wars trilogy, 1977 to 83, the Empire was morally symbolic. The first Star Wars film, A New Hope, told a story of rebels fighting against an evil empire. In the film, the viewer was exposed to many political elements. Now that Palpatine was the Emperor, he appointed Darth Vader as the Fist of the Empire, and together they ruled as Pol Pot, Joseph Stalin, or even Adolf Hitler. So seeing as the Galactic Republic owned most of the galaxy, they controlled most of it, as soon as Order 66 happened, it all flipped and now it was all under the Empire's control. Back to the original ones from 1977 to 83, we see it presents a typical archetypal political situation with insurgents fighting against tyranny, and alleges that 20th century and American world politics are still valid. Unfortunately, it's always perception. You don't always necessarily know who is going to be good or bad when it comes to politics. It's sometimes the same with the Star Wars universe, and you could clearly see that as Palpatine takes over everything, as we originally think he's the good guy. These movies focus on characters who are ruled by hate and anger and fear of the dark side. These totalitarian visualizations in the film generally identifies the Empire with fascism or like Nazis. The Last Jedi was one of the more political movies of the franchise. Star Wars has always been about, had mythology and philosophy and politics in it. And Rian Johnson decided to take the series in a little bit of a different direction while still having those aspects in it. It still stood next to the eternal struggle of light and dark, and it reminded us about what we love about Star Wars, but there's many people who would argue that the newer Star Wars were not as good as the older ones, but that's the same thing it was with the prequels and so on and so forth. It's always the newer generation that shows us what we need to appreciate about the new things, and the older about the older things. Now, an important man to know when thinking about the newer Star Wars movies would be Edward Hallett. He was an English historian and diplomat whose work became an early significant contribution to the literature of international relations theory. So he explains that utopia and reality are thus the two facets of political science, political thought, and sound political life will be found only where both have their place. Thus, the dark and the light are one. You cannot have one without the other, which is the first great lesson of the Grey Jedi. In the newer movies, as Luke is talking to Rey, which is the newer Jedi in the series, he's trying to explain some things to her about the Force, and as she's doing this, the dark side is calling her, apparently. He says, "It offered you something you needed." This shows a larger spectrum in Force wielders, showing there are no villains or heroes, just only the Force. Or for the sake of this argument, politicians, they offer you something you need, thus you're swayed to one side. It doesn't necessarily mean that the other politician is evil just because the other one is offering what you need. It could go either way, because even though they say they're offering you one thing, that doesn't mean that's what you're getting. Now, bringing it back to the Clone Wars series, sometimes we're pushed into situations where we use enemy tactics against our enemies. And a good example of this is after the 9/11 attacks. Torture wasn't necessarily legal, but we began using that here in America. And the only other person I can think of, well, there's quite a few, but the main one I'm thinking of is Saw Gerrera, who was from the Clone Wars originally, and he was later in the series The Rebels. Our government authorized the use of enhanced interrogation techniques. I believe Saw Gerrera was created with the influence of our own government. In the movie, we see this, I think this shows a good portion of how we see politicians. because you'll always have one side saying one thing and the other side saying the other. And everybody likes to believe that they're correct, but it's not always the case. So in this, Luke tells his side of the story of what he saw when Kylo was turning to the dark side. He ignited his lightsaber and he was going to strike him down in his sleep, but the feeling fleeted away as soon as he had the thought, because he couldn't kill him. Now, from Kylo's perspective, it was Luke was going to kill him in his sleep and he had to fight first. Now, ultimately, the truth lied in between those two things, because they both saw a different perspective of it, and they both saw the danger in each other, which led them on the separate paths. Basically, neither of them could see past their own subjective perception. The newer series, in The Force Awakens, there's a scene where Kylo Ren meets, he's the grandson of Darth Vader, but you find that out later. He comes to the conclusion he has to kill his own father, which is Han Solo. Kylo is not inherently evil. He just appears that way given the circumstances. And in The Last Jedi, we see different perspectives that ultimately change the characters' paths. Now, I think that's one of the biggest problems with the way we take care of our political problems nowadays. Now, I know everybody on my political party isn't the greatest person, or they don't have my best intentions in mind, but I do feel that the other side is, well, it's subjectively evil. I don't believe everybody who follows them is, maybe misguided, but I don't want to dive too much into my personal politics, though. Now, the whole reason for bringing up the two different perspectives between Kylo and Luke is because it's impossible to have a side with only heroes calling to a higher power of justice. It is simply impossible. You might have one side that has more people fighting for subjective good, or they have a set of morals or values than the other side, but you're not going to have one side that is entirely for the righteous cause. But because so many people believe that they're fighting the good fight and the other side is just purely evil, it really threatens us as a society. But this rhetoric is constantly used to advance non-liberal agendas, including but not limited to war. Now, this was the same rhetoric former President W. Bush used to, quote, destroy the axes of evil, which he said were Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And because of this perception that we had that we were fighting the absolute just fight, it became the longest war in U.S. history. Often we romanticize the Jedi as being of light and peace. We try to apply this to real life, which can lead to some political damage. Even in the movies, series, games, comics, and books, we see they're only human, among other species. But what is key to understand is idolatry. But what's key to understand is idolatry can be dangerous, and the perception many of us have about the Founding Fathers is a great example of this. To follow religiously certain canonical figures and to try to mindlessly apply their thought to just any circumstance is not what the Founding Fathers would have wanted us to do. They stood for many things, but I believe a lot of us misinterpret what a lot of those things are. I don't want to bash any right-wingers, but I do believe that more of the radical ones, after following so much of what Trump said during his presidency, slowly brought back the KKK into a social norm. Now, I think for everybody under Palpatine, you were expendable, just like Count Dooku was and Darth Maul, who were both betrayed by their master. Unfortunately, Count Dooku didn't see the deception till the end. He also didn't give himself fully to the dark side. He simply wanted to fix things, but he did stray far from the path, so you could say that he got what he deserved, whereas Darth Maul knew he was used ever since the attack on Naboo, where he was cut in half and left for dead, and he was forgotten about. The world kept going, even once he came back into power later on, and his master confronted him again, killing his brother, or his now new Padawan, and Darth Maul was once again pushed down into history. Now, I could be wrong, but I do think of Trump as being more of a Palpatine kind of character. My two favorite characters, Darth Maul because of his psychotic break, and Count Dooku mostly because he's played by Christopher Lee. I would love to go into great detail about both of them, but there's so many videos about them already. I don't think I should just add to that mess. And trust me, I would love to go into great detail about Obi-Wan Kenobi and the relationship he used to have with Count Dooku and the amount of fights and the feuding between Maul and Obi-Wan. The main message I want to get out for those of you who are still watching at this point is that Star Wars teaches us the same thing that history teaches us. We learn from history as to not repeat it. We need to prevent evil from coming into power, and we also need to know that there is no good without evil. Always be cautious of others' perspectives and understand that your perspective is not the only way to solve something. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope you learned something from it and enjoyed it.